Hi guys, Brian from Boas here. Having a litter of baby boas is certainly a highlight of the boa hobby, and many of us have seen online pictures of beautiful litters of perfect little baby boas, and we've been inspired to breed boas of our own. However, there's also a dark side to boa breeding that people are a little bit more reluctant to talk about. There's quite a few different things that can go wrong, with ultimate consequences ranging from minor inconveniences up to the death of your boas. Today I want to go over some of the different things that can go wrong when you're trying to breed your boas, and also discuss ways that you can potentially reduce the risk of these things happening. The decision to breed your boas should never be made lightly. You want to make sure that they're in prime breeding condition, and also that you're in a position to give them the attention and care they need for the breeding project to be successful. So as I've said before, in general, most locality boas should be a minimum of 5 years of age for the females and 4 years of age for the males before you try to breed them. So there is a temptation for people to grow their boas faster, and including by power feeding them more often or larger meals or both. Unfortunately, although the animals can grow faster this way, they don't get into better breeding shape. So when you power feed an animal, it becomes overweight or obese and has a very high fat content. For females to give birth successfully, they need the right musculature. So they need the right amount of muscle. And if they're power fed and they're overweight, odds are much greater that they can have certain health issues when reproducing. It's also quite possible that they'll give rise to smaller litter sizes and more unfertilized embryos if you power feed and get their boas ready that way. So boa breeding is really a very long-term project, so you should be very patient and resist the urge to power feed your animals or to try to breed them when they're too young. When breeding morph boas, they're able to generally breed a little bit younger than locality boas. But again, with morph boas, you're probably looking at females needing to be at least around 4 years old, males around 3 years old. So the next potential problem that can happen with breeding are injuries when you introduce the male and the female. And so this can range from aggression. Sometimes females or males will be aggressive towards each other and they might attack each other. In some cases, people will use multiple males to increase the odds of success. And sometimes the males can be territorial and they can injure each other. And then another thing that can happen is you can have a prolapsed hemipenes. So when the male exerts the hemipenes in order to mate with the female, sometimes there are issues with it going back in to the cloaca and it can get basically stuck out. And if this happens, the hemipene can be destroyed and it may require amputation. So obviously this requires a specialized reptile vet to do. So if you see any issue like this, get your snake to the vet as soon as possible. Sometimes you can use certain techniques to get the hemipenes to go back in to the cloaca in the normal position. In other cases, it does require surgery. And because males have 2 hemipenes, it's possible that even if the male loses a hemipene, he might be able to fertilize the female in the future. So it's not necessarily the end of the line for that male. So I've been lucky and have never had this happen to any of my males, but I've heard about it happening. The next issue that can happen when breeding your boa is that the female might not be able to successfully deliver the live young and or the unfertilized embryos known as slugs. And if this happens, there are several outcomes. So if there is a live young that's stuck in the reproductive tract, typically it ends up dying. And it can often lead to a systemic infection, in which cases the female, unfortunately, will usually die. With retained slugs, often they become calcified and they are retained in the female's reproductive tract. And the female can live a normal life with these present, but she likely will not be able to reproduce in the future. There have actually been some cases though where the female has been able to pass these retained slugs later on, often in the next year of breeding. And in fact, there's a reference in the book, The Reproductive Husbandry of Pythons and Boas by Ross and Marzek, where they talk about this. And this is a good time for me to plug this book, The Reproductive Husbandry of Pythons and Boas. It's by far the best book on breeding boas and pythons. It's out of date right now, or it's out of print, I should say, not out of date. It's out of print, but you should be able to find a copy used if you look online. So definitely want to check this book out. So I had an issue with this back in 2014. I had a female Suriname who retained some eggs and some baby boas. And I took her to my reptile vet, and he gave her a hormone called Pitocin, which sometimes can help the females to pass these unfertilized eggs and babies. And unfortunately, it didn't work in this case. And I brought her home, and the next thing that we were talking about is that the vet could have done a surgery to remove these babies and unfertilized eggs. Unfortunately, the female ended up dying a few days later, so it's quite possible that she had an underlying infection and that the surgery wouldn't have worked anyway. Based on my experience, many of these issues are more likely to happen with true red-tailed boas than with some of the other types of locality boas. And BCC in general are considered to be the hardest boas to reproduce successfully. So the next thing that can happen is the female can drop a litter prematurely. And this happened to me last year, and it was a real bummer. So I had a female Honduran fire-bellied boa, and she was very gravid, and everything looked great. And she was due in about 2 weeks, and I went in to check on her, and I saw that she had dropped a litter. And I looked at the babies, and unfortunately, there were about 15 babies, but only 2 of them were alive. The rest, I attempted to revive them, but they were not alive. They were stillborn. It was a real bummer, one of my big letdown for me last year. But I'm not quite sure why this happened. The female looked like she was in perfect shape. Everything seemed like it was going fine. One thing is that I had bred her the previous year. So she bred in 2018. And then I bred her again in 2019. And in general, I skip a year between breeding my boas. And it's probably a good thing to do. But she seemed like she was in great shape and she was ready to go. And, I bred her, and it ended up having this early delivery. I'm not sure that was the reason why the early delivery happened. It might not have to do with the fact that I bred her 2 years in a row. But in the future, I'm not going to breed any female 2 years in a row because of this. And fortunately, the 2 babies that were alive turned out to be fine. But having to lose these babies that looked like they were going to be perfect was a real letdown. When we're breeding boas, we obviously are going for live, healthy, perfect baby boas. Unfortunately, there are a number of other things that can be born as well besides the perfect baby boas, which I'm going to cover next. The first is something called a slug. And a slug is an unfertilized ovum, and it's basically a oval-shaped object which is about 2 inches or so long. It's kind of this yellowish brown in color, and typically it's kind of hard with this kind of rubbery feel to it. And slugs are thought to occur because you either have an infertile male, or you have a male that wasn't left with the female long enough to properly fertilize all the ova, or also they are thought to be caused by incubation temperatures that are too low. And so a few slugs are generally not that big of a deal, and many litters will have a few slugs, but often people will report litters which are completely slugs, which are a real letdown because these slugs could hypothetically be baby boas. And then slugs sometimes can lead to complications with delivery. The slugs are a lot harder for female boas to pass than a healthy baby boa because they're kind of hard, whereas a baby boa is soft and it comes out of the cloaca really easily. So sometimes slugs can lead to issues with difficulty for females to give birth, and they can also lead to issues like kinking in some of the baby boas. So this is the second thing that you can have. You can have baby boas which have some kind of a malformation. So kinking is often seen where the spine is kinked. In some cases you have very minor kinking, like there's a minor kink in the tail that's not life-threatening, and the baby boa will end up being viable. In other cases you have a major kink which is going to obstruct like passage of food through the throat or something like that, and these animals, unfortunately, they're not going to be viable. Then you can also have other types of malformations. You can have often animals that have only one eye, or they're missing both eyes. And then you can have deformities of the head, like cleft lip, where basically the upper lip is not fully developed. And so these deformities are thought to be related to inbreeding in some cases, although in other cases they're just spontaneous. You know, you can't really completely prevent these things from happening, but by not inbreeding you can reduce the risk of these things happening. And I did a video on inbreeding in the past, so check that out if you're interested in learning more about inbreeding and how you can prevent it. And then a final thing that can happen is you can have stillborn offspring. So the stillborn offspring can be dead, they can be fully formed, perfectly formed, or in some cases they can be deformed. And when I've seen some perfectly formed stillborn offspring, sometimes I wonder if they were alive right before being born and something went wrong during the birthing process and they ended up getting killed. So imperfect and deformed and stillborn offspring is unfortunately something that you'll often have to address when you're breeding boas. So the last few things that can go bad have to do with the baby boas themselves. So the first is that you can have baby boas which appear live and healthy and fine, and they spontaneously die typically about a week or two after being born, before they start feeding. In some cases they have some kind of a defect internally that's not visible, and unfortunately there's really nothing that you could have done to prevent them from dying. So another issue has to do with feeding baby boas. And so with some boas, especially true red-tailed boas, you'll have regurgitation issues, especially with the babies. And I just did a video on regurgitation, so I recommend that you check it out if you haven't already, if you want to learn more about how to prevent regurgitation in baby BCC. And then another issue with some of the locality boas is getting them to feed, because certain locality boas, like some of the island boas, Hog Island, Crawl Key, etc., they're very difficult in some cases to get to feed on baby mice or rats. I found with my Hog Island boas, only about half of the babies feed spontaneously on live mice, and I often will have to assist feed them a mouse tail for a month or two before they'll eat on their own. Even with the best technique and doing everything you can to minimize these risks, often a baby BCC or a baby island boa may end up dying because of either regurgitation or it just might never feed on its own. And a final issue with breeding boas I want to mention is not being able to find homes for the baby boas you produce. So unfortunately, even if you have these healthy baby boas that are ready to go, if you can't find people that want to add them to their collection, you may have an issue. So it really pays to do your research before breeding the boas, and only breed types of boas that there is a good market for and that you're going to not have issues with finding people who want these boas in their collection. One rule of thumb is that you should not breed any boas that you wouldn't be happy with keeping all of the babies indefinitely. So if a few years after they're born, you still have some of the babies, you should still be happy with these babies. Don't breed boas that you're not going to be happy keeping the babies for as long as necessary. And in some cases, it could take up to a year or so to find homes for certain types of boas. So those are some of the negative effects of breeding boas. And unfortunately, Even if you do everything right and your boas are in perfect breeding shape, you can't reduce the risk of these things to zero. There's always the risk that one of these things is going to happen, and it could even lead to the death of your boa. So really think a lot about that before you breed your boas, and really consider the consequences of what could happen if things go wrong. That being said, the results when breeding goes well can be pretty spectacular. This is a 2018 holdback male Honduran firebelly boa. This guy's developing really nicely. You can see he's mostly patternless with some saddles in the middle of his body, but stripes on his neck and towards his tail. He's starting to show the really nice pink and orange coloration that this type of boa is known for. This is a really rare boa in captivity, and I was really happy to successfully breed these animals. So incidentally, this is the mother of this animal is the one that dropped her litter prematurely last year, and most of those babies unfortunately were stillborn with only 2 live animals. So I hope this video was helpful. As always, if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me. Thanks for watching, and enjoy your boas.